I get comments like this a lot. People will say something like, you need a spiritual component, a spiritual element, in order to be able to interpret the Bible correctly. You need the Holy Spirit, you need to be born again, you need to be a Christian or a particular flavor of Christian in order to be able to successfully interpret the Bible. And I think sometimes this is just a product of like naked anti-intellectualism. But I think sometimes, perhaps, I don't know whether or not here, but perhaps sometimes this is a product of a more innocent ignorance about all the different things that you can do with biblical interpretation. Because if a person thinks that the only reason that you would interpret the Bible to begin with is for dogmatic reasons, to create dogmatic theologies to sustain their religious community, if that's the only reason that a person could think of to interpret the Bible, then it does make a little bit of sense to say that you need this spiritual component to do that, because that's a spiritual sort of thing to do with the Bible. But that's not all that people interpret the Bible for. It's certainly not the only thing that academics interpret the Bible for. And by way of demonstrating this, I figured I might show you some of the pages of the table of contents of one of my favorite books on biblical interpretation. So this right here is the first page of the table of contents of a book called Method Matters, which is one of the Society of Biblical Literature's like introductory books on hermeneutics. Each of the chapters in this book is dedicated to a different method of biblical interpretation. It discusses the theory of that interpretation, speaks a little bit about the history of that method of interpretation, and then applies that method of interpretation to a biblical passage. Let's see how many of these chapters we could plausibly say require a spiritual element in order to be able to pull off successfully. Form criticism is an analysis of the relationship between a text genre and the social situation in which that genre emerges. Do we need a spiritual component to be able to do that kind of analysis? No. Source criticism is an analysis of the hypothetical state of biblical texts prior to being edited together in their final form. Do we need a spiritual component to be able to do that? No. Redaction criticism is an analysis of the way a text is edited together. Do we need a spiritual component for that? No. Do we need a spiritual component for textual criticism, traditional historical criticism, comparative approaches, or iconographic approaches? No. Do we need a spiritual something or other in order to do religio-historical or historiographical or psychological or anthropological analysis of the text? No. Do we need that spiritual special something for sociological approaches, narrative, poetic, feminist, or gender-based analysis of the text? No. What about ecological approaches? No. What about ethical approaches? No. Plenty of secular approaches to ethics. We don't need it for any of those at all. Do we need a special spiritual something in order to be able to do theological interpretation or homiletic approaches to the Bible? Perhaps there it might be helpful, depending on exactly how you're doing this theology and this homily. I'll give you those two. What about Latin American approaches to biblical interpretation, or any ethnicity-based approach to biblical interpretation? Do we need a special je ne sais quoi spiritual component for that? No. What about Midrashic interpretation? What about postmodern literary criticism? Do we need that special something for those? No. So perhaps 2 out of 24 methods of biblical interpretation might benefit from that spiritual element. That doesn't seem like very many to me. I'm open to hearing an argument about how we need that spiritual component to be able to do form criticism or redaction criticism or source criticism or something like that. But until that argument is made, I'm going to maintain the belief that it is not necessary for the vast majority of biblical interpretation.